I did a segment a while back, and I called it. I was like, actually, it wasn't even a proper segment. It was just a clip out of one of my gaming streams discussing an independent article by John Rentoul where he compared Liz Truss to Jeremy Corbyn, and I said this is completely nonsensical. They are in no way alike, and I can't believe that anyone would make that comparison. And I'm going to kind of retract some of that, so to speak. Not a huge amount. But I think that there is more to that statement, not in the way that John Rentoul actually meant it when he wrote the article, because he assumed wrongly that they were both, because they're both economic mavericks in the grand scheme of the Overton window of the UK, that they can be compared because they would have both crashed the economy, believing whatever nonsense they have that lies outside the realm of what is politically expedient within UK politics. Now, what I would say is that looking, for example, there was someone who just mentioned in my YouTube chat in that you should you should be natural bedfellow of the Tories because you're living off of savings because inflation is bad, and that traditionally the left have been the people who have been the causes of inflation and in the public conscious, and the right have been the ones who's fixed inflation. The problem is that inflation is happening under the Conservatives right now because they have no way of dealing with it. Now, one thing I've talked on stream before, I mentioned it in the Ash Sarkar segment, I mentioned it when watching an Owen Jones bit previously, but I didn't really expand on it very well, and I was pretty muddled in my words, so I wanted to do a proper segment about this right now. But the issue is that what we need in this country to be able to fix our issues is pro-growth policies, and specifically what I'm talking about are supply-side policies. Now, no justice, people might say. Supply-side economics, that sounds incredibly right-wing for you, but fortunately, there is more than just right-wing supply-side economics. Unfortunately, neoliberal precepts have dominated our kind of economic ecosystem in this country for so long that we've kind of forgotten, really, that there are left-wing elements of supply-side policy that you can use using the power of the state. There is interventionist supply-side policy, and this is where Liz Truss and Jeremy Corbyn both convene. Both Liz Truss and Jeremy Corbyn's platforms, respectively, both prioritised economic growth. Or at least they had the consideration of prioritising economic growth. But the issue is that Liz Truss was wrong. You can't just tax cut your way to growth, and the vast majority of what we've seen out of previous attempts at supply-side policy from the right wing in this country have completely failed.
I'm literally a communist.
Thank you for the follow, Anarcho Arachnid. Welcome to No Justice Stream. So, what Liz Truss's idea is if you cut taxes, you'll get additional investment to be able to have more economic productivity, to be able to increase the supply of goods in the economy. But that's not how that works. That's never been how that works, especially not when you're cutting tax from people who make their incomes via engaging in their labour, which is what the income tax cut that Kwasi Kwarteng engaged with was. And also the corporation tax cut just means they siphon off more money to shareholders, right? Another supply-side policy that's been a kind of staple of the Conservative administration for the past 13 years is the way in which they've tried to deliberately loosen the labour market. In fact, that's what Thatcher did during the 80s to try and bring inflation down. By making the labour market more loose, it thereby incentivised workers to increase their productivity to make them more likely to want to be hired in a time when jobs are far less available. But now the labour market is tighter, that's not really going to work. And we've seen that what actually happens is the workers over the last 13 years, they've not got more productive. We've had a productivity issue for the past 30 years, actually. Productivity has been super stagnant in this country. And all of these supposed supply-side policies that they've tried to engage in to weaken the bargaining power of the working class of this country, all it's led to is people dropping out of the labour market instead of people being less productive because they've been demoralised by not having access to the higher salaries of the not-so-recent past. So that's an issue that we've had with Liz Truss wanting to drive supply-side policies through the right-wing sphere. And to be fair, I think people criticise Liz Truss in how she handled the economy for the wrong things. I'm not saying that she did it well, but they are somehow saying that the tax cuts that she engaged with somehow crashed the economy by themselves, when really and truly what actually crashed the economy, quote unquote, was because the OBR never had a forecast, and the issue really isn't with whether or not they're spending, whether or not they're taxing, what the kind of the kind of the nuances of those particular policy platforms are. What actually really and truly matters is the confidence that the markets have in the government to be able to continue to pay down the debt, which is what the bond market is all about. Obviously, we have a central bank, we are a currency issuer. They actually never really have a problem with this stuff. But actually, the Liz Truss administration proved this in when the bond market was going into free fall, the central bank just engaged in huge amounts of quantitative easing and just bought all of the bonds to stabilize the bond market, which we can just do, right? We can just do that. But the problem is that the actual policies that she was trying to put forward weren't going to have the intended supply side effects to be able to stabilize the economy in that way. And that's the real issue. And I think that if she just published an OBR report and they'd done it sensibly, not just rushed through a mini budget out of nowhere, the markets wouldn't have reacted in the way that they did. Now, interest rates were always going up, which was going to affect people's mortgages regardless of what she did. But the problem is that we are not in what we would usually think of as an inflationary period. In the most of the time, we see inflationary periods because the economy is hot and there's a high level of demand. We're seeing this in the United States right now. The demand in the US economy is higher. The discretionary purchases of things like, for example, consumer electronics are high in the United States currently, as we've seen, as I was mentioning before, about the wages of the working class outstripping inflation in that country has meant that and with all the tax credits been given out with stimulus checks, the economy is hot, and then there is inflation because prices are rising to meet the new demand. That's not the case in the UK. The issue we have, as was identified by Liz Truss, was that we don't have enough supply. The energy prices are too high, the food prices are too high. All of these ability for the working class to engage in discretionary consumption is incredibly constrained. Because of it's literally called the cost of living crisis. So the ability for people to be able to purchase the basic things that they need is difficult. So how can we have too much demand in this country when people can't even afford to pay their own basic rent and bills and food? How are they then going to go and then overheat the economy by then purchasing a bunch of discretionary things on top of that? That's not what's happening, right? The issue is all from the cost end. It's a cost push inflation that we're seeing right now. This is where Jeremy Corbyn comes in, and where supply-side leftism is the correct policy that we as a movement should be embracing as far as I'm concerned. What we need to be doing moving forward is looking at the way in which we can intervene using the state to boost the supply of goods and services in our economy. It's going to take state investment. This is why the real anti-growth coalition are the neoliberals who refuse to use public money. So why Keir Starmer coming out saying, I'm not going to get out my checkbook, is like literally, it's the most economically illiterate thing that they could be doing right now. Because state investment is the only thing that's going to fix this currently. And that was the whole platform that we saw from Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019. These were pro-growth manifestos. Let's be real, right? There's a lot of discussion that we have at the moment where there's this kind of overarching view in the political sphere that people on the left all believe in degrowth type policies, but that's not what we represent at all, especially not people who believe in the kind of social democratic policies that were being put forward by Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell in 2017 and 2019. By using the power of the state, investing in new council homes, new energy generation, we're increasing the supply of the important commodities at the heart of our economy. If we look at the inflationary periods right now, I mentioned this on stream on Sunday. If you divide it between goods and services, and the levels of inflation we're seeing between the two,
I'm literally a communist.
What we're actually seeing is goods far outstrip services. So we need to be able to increase the supply of these things, especially in energy. That's why, to be fair, the one thing that's actually good, that could theoretically be good coming out of the Starmer playbook, is to be able to massively increase our provision of green energy production. But the problem is that they're trying to do it through private investment rather than public investment. So instead of the money going into making energy more abundant and cheaper from the state, the subsidy that they're putting into these public-private partnerships is just going to get siphoned off into profit rather than used to bring the price of energy down, which is not supply-side leftist policies. It's just subsidy. This isn't the good policy that we should be approaching with to try and bring down inflation. And that's the irony of the neoliberal order, is that they fully have embraced the monetarist quantity theory of money of inflation. That is, that inflation, I mean, they almost define it. They almost define it as being the increase in the money supply, when that's not what inflation is. Inflation is the overall increase of goods and services within the economy, of consumer goods and services, right? Rather than asset prices. We have asset price inflation and consumer price inflation, and inflation is usually discussed as we understand it within the actual consumer price index or retail price index, regardless, or the Vimes Boots index, if you'd like to look at it in that fashion. So that's an issue. And then when what we actually be needing to do. So when you look at, for example, what Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are both approaching, it's just the same old, same old. They are the true anti-growth coalition in that neither of them actually want to be able to put in the work to be able to increase the supply of goods in the economy at the moment. Because we have a crisis of demand, but we also have a crisis of supply as well. That's why we have stagflation. So we have a recession, or at least incredibly low growth, with increasing inflation as well. So we need policies on both ends that are going to work. And what it is going to involve is all of the stuff that we saw from the Corbyn administration. You bring rents and house prices down through a massive investment in new houses, new housing supply, and that's going to involve deregulation. I know, no justice. You're talking about deregulation as a leftist, 100%. We need to deregulate construction in this country, or planning at the very least, rather. Planning needs to be deregulated. We need to ensure that NIMBYs have no ability to be able to control building in this country. We need more houses, more energy, more onshore wind, more onshore solar. We need to increase the supply of these things that are at the heart of our economy. Because that's essentially how inflation is, that's how inflation works. This is how the Keynesians were right all along. In the ways in which they described inflation, that it is always going to be about supply and demand in the economy, rather than, for example, the ways which monetarists would talk about it in the quantity theory of money, because that's been thoroughly disproved. Look at Japan. Their debt to GDP ratio is fucking 250%. And they've not seen inflation in 30 years. The idea that inflation can only ever be defined as the amount of money in the economy is completely nonsensical. And as we've seen here, there are definitive policy solutions that we have by using government spending to be able to increase the supply side of the economy, to be able to bring down inflation. And that's what it's going to take. It's not going to... You can give people money forever. That will deal with the cost of living crisis as we have at the moment. That's not going to grow the economy. And in a sense, that's why I think that the Keynesians are wrong in that sense too. That we can't just fix everything from the demand end of the economy, because it doesn't quite deal with the issues that we're seeing with price shocks coming from exogenous effects to the economy, like the war in Ukraine or the COVID pandemic, for example. That's the issue. That's the big issue that we have. And that's really where, again, as Corbyn and Liz Truss both kind of converge in their issues with how to fix the economy. Unfortunately, only one of their plans works, and that's the leftist plan. That I say Jeremy Corbyn, I really mean John McDonnell. I have to give him his plaudits. Most of this stuff comes from John McDonnell rather than Jeremy Corbyn. John McDonnell was really the architect of a lot of these policy platforms. And JDM is right. A federal job guarantee is also a good idea too, rather than relying on unemployment as our ability to be able to control the labour market. We should use the state to be able to ensure that we treat unemployment for what it is, a political choice that is unnecessary. And it does also stabilise the economy to be able to weather exogenous shocks, as you're correctly saying there, JDM. You're 100% correct. So that should be the ideology for you to be able to take moving forward. Supply side leftism. That is do I think it's going to be some kind of economic panacea? No. But what I am saying is that a future of a Labour Party specifically that is promising to not spend money, because again, The only reason why they're promising not to spend money is because this economic idea that inflation can always be tied to excess government spending, for example, doesn't actually play out in the real world when you look at the reasonable amount of the economic matters, right? That's not how it works. But that's been so ingrained in the public conscious because that was essentially received wisdom from the Chicago School up until very, very recently, where economics classes are now only changing their models back to actually look at how inflation really works in real terms. Like, you don't see quantity theory of money explanations for inflation anywhere really in education nowadays, whereas it was everywhere when the current crop of journalists, the current crop of politicians, the current crop of engaged voters in this country, they only know the monetarist theories that surround inflation at the moment. And that's why, quote, balancing the books is completely nonsensical as a position, because it doesn't actually make sense when you look at the way the economy functions in reality. That's the problem. So, and because we have a media machine that has essentially frozen into the public conscious through the implicit assumptions and by manufactured consent that more spending equals bad. Like, why do you think that Tony Blair made the central bank independent in the first place? Because he wanted to reassure the electorate that they would not be profligate spenders. That's why they did it. That's why it was the whole reason behind it. It was an optical thing to do. And I think that what we're looking at right now is we're seeing that come home to roost. An independent central bank is now raising interest rates to try and cool demand when demand is also incredibly low. We're about to head into a recession, or at least low growth that is not actually a recession, but not good either. We need much higher growth, and that's going to be tempered somewhat, by a central bank raising interest rates when it doesn't need to. All because them raising interest rates, which really, again, is what screwed over. It's what screwed over Liz Truss, was the raise in interest rates that then inflated people's mortgage payments, thereby compounding the cost of living crisis. Right, people who had mortgages, who were already on the edge of consumption, who were not really able to pay the bills at that point, weren't engaging in the discretionary spending that would tell you that we had an overheated economy, are now even less likely to be able to spend, and so we're now driving down demand, which is what causes a recession in the first place. It's nonsensical policy. It doesn't make any sense at all, and it's all downwind of the implicit assumptions that has completely overtaken the public consciousness in this country, and it's because the people who are in the media, who make the public aware of these things, are fucking idiots. They're idiots who don't understand all this stuff, who have only ever absorbed it all through the groupthink that they have been a part of through all of the different private schools and universities and social clubs that all of these people are all a part of at the same time. And they've never questioned these implicit assumptions that have been continually proven through empirical evidence to be wrong. You still get people telling you, nowadays, I had to respond on TikTok to somebody saying that raising the minimum wage would cause an increase in unemployment, which isn't true. It's not true from empirical studies. Arindrajit Dubey has a great thread on it where you can, the Cates index is the ratio of median pay to minimum wage, and you can actually, there have been some studies showing that you can have that as high as 80% and still not actually affect unemployment. But because it's just been part of the economic lexicon of the right wing of this country, have control over not only the levels of power, they also have control over the media, and they also have control of the think tanks that then feed the media the justifications that they then put to the political class to create this one-party rule that we have at the moment, where any amount of heterodox economics goes completely unheard. Like, we're literally like Ha-Jun Chang was talking about this. There was a really great clip he shared on Twitter of Ha-Jun Chang saying that this economic orthodoxy has meant that people who have heterodox economic views are seen as extremists. I'm seen as an extremist. I'm just like, nothing I've advocated for, nothing that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell advocated for is anything other than social democracy, proper, real, like, social democratic principles. But because it falls outside of what is judged to be the acceptable realm of discourse because of a bunch of implicit assumptions of Oxford School journalists, it doesn't get a look in, and I'm treated as I literally, as someone who is espousing social democratic principles, I'm treated like a trot and a pariah by the Labour mainstream elite, because at the end of the day, they don't understand this shit either. And you're absolutely right, Jim Speak. They have to dive balls deep into the green sector, and properly invest in this stuff, but it has to be done from the state rather than with these public-private partnership things that's being thrown out there by Keir Starmer and their GB Energy style policy they have, which is supposed to be a state-owned energy generator, but it's not. It's just going to be a slush fund to be able to throw money at private companies, which, as I said, it may increase the supply of energy, increase it overall. But I have this kind of incredibly I'm very apprehensive that it will just lead to asset stripping, and it will lead to all of that subsidy money being taken out in profit rather than being used to keep prices low. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that's making our country uncompetitive on a global scale economically is the fact that our business rates for energy consumption are incredibly high. Why would you do business in the UK paying £16 per kilowatt hour for electricity when you could go to Finland and pay 7? It doesn't make any sense, right? We are being uncompetitive because we have taken so much of this this anti-state intervention gospel as economic orthodoxy, and it's not been challenged for 40 fucking years. Very frustrating, very, very frustrating. The right wing have actually been masterful at the way they've convinced people. I kind of find it impressive because the left just don't have an answer from our side. We can't work it out. Well, luckily for you, Jim, I have given you the answer. You now have the answer, and you can take that back to people. You can take what I've just told you, and then you can tell people, no, it can be different, and it should be different, right? As JDM was pointing out in chat, good things are not just possible, but they are necessary. And a lot of this, again, is the death of manufacturing because of the over-financialisation of the economy during the Thatcher years that was then never fixed by Blair, is another thing that we have to blame. And that's not just to blame for the economic malaise that we're in, it's also to blame for a lot of the cultural malaise that we're in. It's to blame for a lot of the reasons why the voting patterns happen in the way that they do, because of the exodus of young people from previous manufacturing communities into urban centres. It's all historical materialism at the end of the day. It's all historical materialism. When you look at the way things have turned out over the course of the last 40 years or so. But yes, spending's good. And I think people are too harsh on Liz Truss. Obviously, she's an idiot. And the actual policy solutions that she was putting forward were bad, but at least she diagnosed the problem. And the problem is that no one realised and no one bothered to report on the fact that the same problem was identified by the left, but the solution was never seen as being correct because it didn't fall within the acceptable level of discourse within the public, within not just in the media sphere, but also in the public sphere as well. I think most people supported the platform of Jeremy Corbyn in 17 and 19 because it promised stuff that they liked. Because they believed in public ownership of utilities on some kind of a moral basis rather than on some kind of utilitarian economic basis, which I believe you can make a case for both. And we should have made a case for both at the time.